In 1968, two little boys were found dead days apart from each other. The autopsies showed they were both strangled, and the stab marks on one's legs were made seconds after he was killed. The mysterious letters that were found were ignored by police because they thought it was a prank. Who would joke around about someone's death? The main suspect was a 10-year-old child named Mary Bell. What would drive a 10-year-old child to want to take the life of two little boys? Scotswood, north of London, was a metropolitan neighborhood in the West End region of Newcastle. It was a broken slum for a poor working-class community, covered by trash heaps, empty fields, and abandoned buildings. Doors were kept unlocked and children were in schools. But in the height of summer, they were all left out to play without parents supervising them. 3-year-old Brian Howe wanted in on the fun. He lived on White House Road with his sister, mother, and father. On July 31, 1968, after having lunch, Brian asked his dad if he could go out and play with the dog. His father allowed him, and minutes later, he checked outside and saw Brian's chubby, fair head happily chattering away with some other neighborhood kids. But just a few hours later, Brian's dad would be going from door to door, asking neighbors if they had seen Brian, but no one had. A search party was formed and they combed through the neighborhood for hours, searching for the little boy, and they all hoped for a safe return. How far could a 3-year-old go after all? But as the sun started to set, they realized it was time to involve the police. At 11:10 p.m., behind some large concrete blocks across the railroad tracks where the local kids played, the police made a horrifying discovery. They found Brian's body, scantily hidden by grass and some pulled-out weeds. Beside him, there was a pair of broken scissors. As they looked over his body, they saw puncture marks on his thighs. His privates had been partially skinned and clumps of his hair had been cut away. But there was one more injury they would not notice till much later because it had been made with a razor blade. On Brian's belly, someone had cut an N in strokes, but a fourth stroke had been added to change the N into an M. An autopsy determined that Brian had been strangled to death. His time of death was placed at 7 hours earlier, around 3 p.m., shortly after he was seen playing with the neighborhood children. Something about the wounds led them to believe that they were made by someone with a small amount of strength. Gentleness to the death was how one detective described it. Their suspect was likely a child, which made their suspect pool to be the 1,200 children in the area. Detectives got to work questioning them. A week later, in a solemn ceremony, Brian Howe was buried. There were over 200 people in attendance. Among them were detectives on the lookout for anyone acting suspiciously. They soon found what they were looking for in a girl standing, laughing and rubbing her hands together as the little coffin was brought out of the Howe home. She was a familiar face to detectives as one of 2 children that stood out to detectives during the questioning. Her name was Mary Bell, and she was 10 years old. The first time detectives had questioned Mary and her friend, Norma, the 2 girls had admitted to playing with Brian on the day he was murdered, but they hadn't seen him after lunchtime. The answers were possible, but they behaved strangely. Mary was evasive while Norma laughed. The next day, detectives were back to question them. This time, Mary added a twist to her story. She said that she had seen an 8-year-old local boy hit Brian the afternoon he died. The boy also had a small pair of scissors that had a broken or bent leg. The police had never released information about the scissors found near Brian's body, so this was a very promising lead. However, when detectives tracked down the boy and questioned him, they found out that he and his parents had been at Newcastle International Airport that afternoon, along with hundreds of witnesses. It was clear Mary either knew too much or was the murderer, and detectives were starting to lean heavily on the latter. A few days later, Norma's parents contacted the detectives with some information Norma had for them. Norma had told them that Mary had shown her Brian's body after she had murdered him. Mary had also shown her the blade and scissors she had used to mark Brian's belly. When detectives asked her to show it to them, Norma led the police back to the crime scene and easily showed them the blade. The next day, detectives showed up at Mary's home to question her again, but she was a lot more defensive. "You're trying to brainwash me," she said. Who exactly were these 2 kids? Did they really have anything to do with Brian's murder? Mary was born to 17-year-old Elizabeth Bell, a well-known local prostitute known as Betty. When hospital staff tried to place baby Mary in her arms, Betty screamed, "Take the thing away from me." Betty did everything to get rid of Mary while she was a baby. She tried to drown Mary in the bath and often overdosed on sleeping pills. Sometimes, little Mary found the pills herself, which were left around the small room. 4 times she was brought to the hospital near death to have her stomach pumped. Another time, Mary was thrown from a first-floor window and sustained brain damage. Later, doctors would find out that the area of her brain that is related to controlled activities and the capacity for decision-making was damaged. But whether this was from the fall or the abuse she experienced remains unknown. When these near-death scenarios didn't claim Mary, her mother tried to give her away. Once, she even sold her to a mentally unstable woman. Mary grew to be a bully with a sadistic streak. She was antisocial and she terrorized the other children. If she got hurt, she would lash out violently. By the time she got into Delaval Road Junior School, other children learned to be wary of her. The only person who gave Mary the time of day was her next-door neighbor, Norma, who coincidentally had the same surname as she did. Norma was 2 years older than Mary, but the pair were as thick as thieves because Norma had learning difficulties and could easily be controlled. Detectives were convinced that Norma was their best bet to get a full confession. But when they went back to question her, she changed her story. Norma admitted that not only was she there when Mary murdered Brian Howe, but she had also lent a hand as well. Mary had told Brian to lie down. Then she pinched his nose. Brian soon started to turn purple and struggle. Mary said her hand was getting tired and asked Norma to hold him still, but she had left and only returned after Mary called her to show her Brian's body and mark his belly. The admission stumped detectives, and they soon remembered another murder that had taken place in the same area 3 months before Brian's murder. At first, it looked like an accident. Now, they weren't so sure. On Saturday, 25th, May 1968, there were 3 boys playing in one of the many derelicts on St. Margaret's Road. A worker found a 3-year-old Martin Brown lying dead in an upstairs room. An autopsy could not determine a cause of death, but detectives had found an empty bottle of aspirin nearby and concluded that the boy had swallowed some pills and overdosed on them. A day later, the police were called once again, this time to a local nursery school. The building had been ransacked and vandalized, but it was what they found there that stood out. 4 notes admitting to murdering Martin, all scribbled in Crayola. They said, "We did murder Martin Brown. I murder so that I may come back." And on another one it says, "We murder, watch out." The police brushed the letters off because they figured it was a prank. The next week when Mary Bell was in her classroom, she wrote a letter in her notebook. "On Saturday, I was in the house, and my mom sent me to ask Norma if she would come up the top with me. We went up and we came down at Margaret's Road, and there were crowds of people beside an old house. I asked what was the matter. There had been a boy who just lay down and died." At the bottom, there was a picture that she drew of a boy lying down in the exact same position that he was found in, with a bottle of pills beside him with the word tablet. She also drew a worker walking towards the body. Her letter did not strike the teacher as odd, so nobody questioned Mary Bell. They went back to Martin's mother to question her about anything that stood out to her after Martin's murder. It wasn't long before she mentioned Mary and Norma. Some days after Martin's murder, the two would come to her house asking if they could see Martin. When she told them he was dead, she said they knew and wanted to see Martin in his coffin. They also asked if she missed her son or cried for him. The horrified mother had ordered them out of the house, but the incident had stayed on her mind long afterwards. In addition, one of the boys who found Martin's body had also seen Mary and Norma outside the building when the little boy's body was found. As detectives looked through their records, they noticed a trail of violent behavior by the two around the neighborhood. Mary had tried to strangle 3 little girls and filled their mouths with sand while Norma held them down. A little boy said they had pushed him from the roof of an air raid shelter, but because of their age, both girls had only gotten a warning. Mary and Norma were finally linked to Brian's murder when forensic examination showed that some gray and maroon fibers found on Brian's body matched Mary's woolen dress and Norma's skirt. In addition, the same gray fibers from Mary's woolen dress were also found on Martin's body as well. The 2 girls were arrested and formally charged with 2 counts of manslaughter. The trial of Mary and Norma captured the attention of the entire nation. It was rare to have female serial killers, even rarer for their age. Both girls testified in their defense and pointed fingers at the other as the mastermind. Norma cried and stumbled during her questioning, but Mary was defiant and unrepentant, even arguing with the prosecution. The motive of the murder was solely for pleasure and excitement. On December 17, 1968, Norma was acquitted of all charges. She was deemed to be a passive, slow-witted partner in crime, and she was allowed to go home. As for Mary, she was convicted of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility due to psychiatric reports. The 11-year-old cried as she became the youngest ever serial killer and was detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, which means until someone decides to release her. One of Mary's first guests behind bars was her mother. Betty would ask her to write letters and draw pictures. What Mary didn't know was that her mother was selling those pictures and letters to the newspapers. Sometimes, Betty even made up stories and forged letters that would make Mary seem even more psychotic. But Mary was no docile prisoner either. At 16, she escaped from prison but was quickly found. To help ease her into society, Mary was moved into a hostel. There she met a married man and got pregnant. After serving 12 years for taking the lives of 2 little boys, the law decided Mary had paid her debt to society. At the age of 23, she was given a new name and a new start to life. Mary's first job was in a local children's nursery, but the probation officers thought this was inappropriate. From then, she was banned from ever working with children. At first, she went back to her birthplace and lived with her mother, saying that she wanted her daughter to meet Granny, but soon realized that no one wants a murderer for a neighbor, and then she disappeared, going from town to town. She changed her name again and ended up having a daughter. 14 years later, Mary was in the tabloids again. This time, she had teamed up with an author to write a biography about what had led to her murdering the boys. Mary gave detailed accounts of a troubled childhood due to her prostitute mother's abusive and alcoholic nature. She also made claims that her mother prostituted her to men from the age of 4. Betty was dead by then, so there was no one to deny these allegations. But what reason could Mary have to lie? Tens of thousands of pounds worth. Mary used the money to move from a cramped rental flat to a brand new home. It was a choice they would soon regret when news hit the press that the child murderer was profiting from her crimes. Mary was found living with her common-law husband and 14-year-old daughter in a freshly painted Victorian terrace perched on the hillside. She had never told her daughter her vile history, but now she was forced to due to her greed. Mary and her daughter were soon taken away to protective custody, but her partner was left behind, and he milked the press to his heart's content, walking out of the house to the beach, paddling and crying. Later, he would take himself to a dingy bar close to home and down scotch and ginger. For an hour, he talked about how Mary was the gentlest, warmest person he had known, and her only dream in life was to work with children. It's upset her a great deal that she is forbidden from doing so. There was further outrage in 2003 when the court granted Mary and her daughter the right to live anonymously for the rest of their lives. This was later extended to include Mary's granddaughter as well. Norma Bell, Mary's long-forgotten accomplice, was later given 3 years probation for breaking and entering. She was also placed under psychiatric supervision, after which Norma faded from public view. Some say she died from cancer in 1989, but others believe that just like Mary Bell, she is still alive and trying to live a normal life.